What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was ordered to rebuild the Uzumaki clan with Konoha's women? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Naruto sighed as he took off his orange jumpsuit and dropped it haphazardly onto a chair, too tired and preoccupied to even think about cleaning it. Too darn proud and happy to care either. He had just become a shinobi. After 3 years of failure and ridicule, he had done it. And all it took was sneaking into the Hokage tower, stealing a scroll and learning an awesome jutsu from it. That jutsu was the center of his thoughts. Kage Bunshin was amazing. He'd spent years unsuccessfully trying to make the Bunshin work, but a few hours with the scroll of seals had given him a skill that could defeat a Chunin. Granted, the Chunin in question was Mizuki, but the gray-haired traitor had been able to take down Iruka-sensei, so did that mean Naruto was in some sense better than his academy teacher? Probably not, although mobbing him with clones might work in a straight-up fight. Putting aside the question of how he would match up against Iruka-sensei, the mere fact that a single technique could make him so much better was something that he couldn't stop thinking about. Kage Bunshin was way better than Bunshin in any way Naruto could think of. It was easier to use, it was solid, and that was all he could think of. Shadow clones weren't the only awesome things in his arsenal. It hadn't escaped Naruto's notice that he'd managed to defeat the Hokage with a basic henge. And Kawarimi was certainly useful as well, even if he hadn't used it against anyone more significant than Sasuke Teme. The inescapable conclusion was that ninjutsu was freaking awesome. On the surface this didn't seem like a momentous revelation. The Shodem Hokage's Mokuton and the Nidaim's mastery of water jutsu were just the first examples of legendary jutsu to come to mind, and there were countless shinobi with reputations for showcasing exotic and amazing skills. But there were amazing things that he could learn. Naruto wasn't suddenly going to develop Mokuton or find a mysterious old man in the woods who would somehow teach him mastery of Suiden jutsu, so the realization that he could learn a useful skill like Kage Bunshin in a few hours was more world-shaking than the newfound knowledge of the demon sealed in his gut. Or wherever the hell it really was. If one technique was enough to beat Mizuki and graduate, why stop there? He could get better, there were skills out there that he could learn. He wasn't a failure. So jutsu were awesome. The problem was that he only knew henge, kawarimi, and Kage Bunshin. He wanted more. He needed more. If every jutsu he learned was even a quarter as awesome as Kage Bunshin, he'd be Hokage in no time. The first order of business was adding more jutsu to his repertoire. This wouldn't be easy. Those that had shinobi in their families had people teaching them taijutsu and ninjutsu and all kinds of stuff. And those with civilian parents could arrange for tutoring or help their children in less direct ways. Naruto had no one. He was all alone, so he had no one to teach him or show him or to even just be there when he needed some company. The closest he had to a family were the old man and Ichiraku Tuchi and Ayame. He loved them with all his heart, but they weren't there for him like a real family would be. Not that he blamed them. They didn't have an obligation to nurture every adorable orphan in their life. Well, maybe the Sandaime did, but that seemed like a complicated issue. He needed more jutsu. He wanted to have a large family, with many children, and what kind of father would let their child grow up without as many cool techniques as possible? He wanted to leave a legendary legacy for the clan he had yet to build. Cool jutsu. I gotta get me some of those, he mumbled to himself. Easier said than done though, given that he was the scapegoat of the entire village for stupid reasons he couldn't do anything about. So where could he get some new jutsu? The old man was probably busy, he was the damn Hokage after all. And Iruka-sensei was injured. Asking the Kyuubi no Kitsune seemed like a bad idea, and he didn't even know how to get in contact with the demon were he even inclined. And what could a mass of malevolent chakra in the form of a fox teach him anyway? Swing your tails and squish things, puny mortal. Oh, you don't have any tails? Sucks for you. And that was assuming the fox could even talk. But there was no one else to ask. So what could he do? He spent quite some time tossing and turning in his bed, trying to figure out where he should go from here. Just before exhaustion took him, however, he remembered something from Iruka's lectures, one of the few he had ever bothered to listen to. Every Hokage, in addition to having a mastery of basic shinobi techniques, created their own unique skills that set them apart from their fellows in ways that became legendary. Quote, so, since he was going to be a Hokage, he needed his own techniques. That was about the first thought that came to his mind when he woke up. The first one that had nothing to do with ramen, that is. But what to do? What kind of super awesome cool technique could he make that no one else had ever made? It would have to be original, cool and easy to use, strong as well but hard to copy or imitate. So he did the one thing he thought he'd never have to do. He went to the library. Most people thought that Naruto was an idiot and completely inept. That was a mistaken perception. He was actually rather clever. However, he lacked knowledge and understanding, the two things that actually turn intellect and wisdom into unusable force. Which is why every time any teacher actually bothered to sit down with Naruto to teach him something, he seemed to pick it up at light speed. Too bad none of them had ever cared enough to actually see who he was beyond their biased preconceptions. Except Iruka-sensei, but that was recent development. But Naruto knew he wasn't an idiot. He just didn't know about stuff. Mostly because nobody ever told him anything, they just took it for granted that it had already been explained to him, going in one ear and out the other. Therefore, since he couldn't depend on anyone anymore, he was a ninja now. Legally an adult, he had to do it on his own. And that meant studying, which meant having to go to the library. Getting into the library was a ridiculous task on its own. First, he had to spend 2 hours going back and forth between the library and the Hokage's tower, filling out and filing obviously unnecessary paperwork that was solely enforced just to discourage him from getting anything done. He had to verify 3 times over that he was actually who he said he was, that he was a ninja, that he did have a place of residence in Konoha. From this he learned a valuable lesson. Use a fucking henge. Now to find books on jutsu theory, chakra manipulation theory, jutsu creation theory, jutsu analysis theory. Well, any kind of theory that had to do with chakra, techniques and jutsu. The first book he found, Elemental Manipulation Theory, turned out to be a pile of crap. Judging by its wear and tear, it was quite a well-read book. Most of it was about fire jutsu, and it didn't really teach any theory. It was mostly along the lines of, Type 2 Kaiden projection techniques with a horse to tiger lead-in can have their effective area increased by adding a rat before the next tiger. And then it would go on to list all the other technique-specific tweaks that had to be made for that general rule to work for the 10 skills that it listed. And then there was a list of 15 Type 2 Kaiden projection techniques that it explicitly said not to use this trick with, and a warning that using the tweak with jutsu not explicitly listed risked having it explode prematurely in your lungs. While that was one of the more ridiculous examples, everything else in the book appeared to run along the same lines. It was essentially a bunch of variations on specific jutsu, with its theory being a bunch of fancy but useless explanations about types and charging sequences and whatever else they wanted to print just to make it seem like this wasn't a convoluted list of jutsu. Having wasted nearly an hour trying to make sense of that pile of crap, Naruto was even more discouraged by his next find. The Encyclopedia of Elemental Theory and Alteration Reactions for Ninjutsu, 30th edition, was a massive book that went way over his head. It seemed like it would be a great reference, once he actually could understand things like pressure-induced backflow of Tenketsu C-3445. Forcing water nature from the low-pressure end of the system at a rate of 60 s.cu carbon monophosphide. See Appendix J3 for curvature conformity of the corresponding E value to the current elemental ratings. He guessed that he'd come back to that one in about 80 years. At this point he wanted to scream in frustration, only managing to hold it in because that would get him kicked out of the library and he wasn't ready to quit. Naruto refused to believe that he wasn't ready to create jutsu. There had to be a better, more simple approach than spending the next 100 years or so trying to make heads or tails of the encyclopedia, or just randomly flipping through seals hoping that he didn't spontaneously combust. Although with Kage Bunshin that might make an acceptable last resort. Academy students didn't really think about how commonplace it was, but Kawarimi no Jutsu was an incredible technique, and it only took 5 seals. Henge was pretty awesome too, and that only took 3. And Kage Bunshin only had 1. Granted, the Shadow Clone used a special unique seal and the middle bore of Henge was actually a weird variation that required twisting and interlocking fingers on the inside. Naruto was still pissed that he'd had to figure out that little quirk on his own. He ignored the traitorous thought that he probably hadn't been paying attention when they went over that bit. So these amazing jutsu requiring relatively few seals had to mean that he didn't need to know about tenketsu backwash or whatever the crap that was in order to at least start making jutsu. He'd come back to that stuff later, once he actually had some idea what to make of it. Much later, the third book he found was nothing short of perfect for his needs. Well, he might have been biased considering the utter frustration caused by the first two, but it was a whole lot better. The title, Fundamentals of Ninjutsu, A Guide to Mastery, Alteration, and Creation, was kind of dry and boring, but Iruka-sensei used to say something about fundamentals and basics and knowing that kind of stuff being important, so Naruto thought it could be a good start. The stiff binding and dust on the cover meant the book wasn't that popular, so it seemed it probably wasn't very good. It turned out that fundamentals were a lot cooler than he expected. He was hooked from the introduction. Whoever this Hiruzen guy was really knew how to write a book. What does it mean to master a jutsu? Many are satisfied when they can perform their skills perfectly, 10 times out of 10, wasting virtually no chakra. Some are more stringent in their requirements, saying mastery is being able to use the skill under pressure without giving it undue attention. You can draw the bar higher and higher, even so much so that no one could possibly manage to master a single jutsu in their lifetime. But it is my belief that trying to nail down a technical definition for mastery is missing the point. One can never master a jutsu. Mastery is a never-ending journey. Every time you perform a jutsu, you understand it a little bit more. You will never be able to execute a jutsu exactly the same way twice, but this is not a bad thing. After practicing hundreds of times, you start to gain an understanding that goes beyond the basics. If I hold this seal longer, fluctuate my chakra in this way, the jutsu will behave just a little differently. The more you understand your jutsu, the more versatile and useful they will be. Maybe your opponent is too fast for your Kaden Gokakyu, but you know how to focus it to trade power for speed. What if you are sparring, and you don't want to hurt your partner? Are you forced to reduce your arsenal, or do you know how to take the bite out of your heavy hitters? Doing a jutsu perfectly is nothing more than using it the best way you know how in the current context. The more you master ninjutsu, the more you can alter them to fit the situation. Perhaps you are thinking, oh, that sounds pretty simple, but it also sounds like a lot of work. If you aren't, that's what you should be thinking, because that is the most important thing to remember about this approach to jutsu. You will need to practice a lot. And then you will need to practice some more. And after that, more practice. And practice 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 and practice. I hope that hasn't scared you off, but that is something that needs to be understood right from the start. You may not be suited to this approach. Most ninja have a fairly concise repertoire of between 10 and 20 jutsu, often focusing on only a third of that. This kind of generalist attitude may not work for you. Although practicing your jutsu over and over again is something I'd recommend even if you don't intend to master ninjutsu, this will require you to commit a lot of time even to jutsu you will never end up using for any practical purpose. Naruto supposed that could be at least part of the reason it looked like this book hadn't been read in years. This whole mastery thing sounded like a lot of work. He felt something though, of building tension as he read the introduction, something on the edge of his thoughts that was saying this is going somewhere that kept him from looking for another book. Elemental Manipulation Theory was a popular book. The checkout history and the multiple copies on the shelves proved it. He could see why, with the quick and dirty tricks to altering popular jutsu, and it would almost be tempting if you ignored all the theory. In fact, he was willing to bet everyone ignored the theory crap in that book. Fundamentals of Ninjutsu was something else entirely. It was obviously built on a solid foundation, but it demanded effort and understanding, with the promise that it would all be worth it somewhere way down the line. It was almost like this Hiruzen guy was challenging him. He was offering Naruto exactly the kind of path to creating ninjutsu that he'd been looking for, and then saying that he probably couldn't handle the hard work. Well, he could handle it. He had more stamina than anyone else in the academy, and he wasn't afraid of hard work. He'd just never really known what to apply that hard work to. I won't be teaching you tricks to make your jutsu do this or that. I'll be guiding you into discovering those tricks for yourself, so that you understand them inside out. The more you do this, the easier it will get, and you will begin to instinctively understand jutsu theory that if I were to try and explain to you in words at this moment would make you want to bash your head against a stone wall before trying to do the same to mine. You will make mistakes. You will get frustrated. And most importantly, this will take time. Doing jutsu over and over again is a relatively quick and easy endeavor, but you will quickly find yourself getting tired. The limit of how much you can practice will be your greatest barrier. The next chapter is almost exclusively dedicated to learning about yourself and finding your limits. Know your limits. Crossing them can have disastrous consequences. Exhausting your chakra or burning your pathways can lay you out for weeks. Messing up certain jutsu due to tiredness or careless alteration could be even worse. When you are a Junin, you'll be able to test more dangerous things or skip many safe intermediate steps when testing jutsu using Kage Bunshin, a B-rank clone technique with the ability to use chakra that transfers its experiences to the user when it dispels. Naruto's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Kage Bunshin was even more awesome than he thought it was. And that meant that he could do even more awesome stuff. Like try not so safe alterations to jutsu. The blonde had to resist the urge to burst out into maniacal laughter for some reason. Small steps are the key. I will show you how to master your jutsu. The experience you gain will allow you to alter them more and more as you understand them and yourself. And small alterations will become larger alterations, and soon you'll be creating jutsu. The most important part of jutsu creation is creativity. Start simple. If you imagine a grand jutsu, you're stuck trying to fill in the massive gap between the basic projection of flames to that flaming tornado you want. After you have learned the basic chakra control exercises, which are integral to finding your limits, understanding your chakra, and extending the amount of time you can practice, I will teach you some very simple elemental techniques. 2 from each element. Since I don't expect you to immediately think up ways to alter them, I will be instructing you on several things to play around with. Your job is to pay attention to how each thing you do affects each jutsu. Once you've had some practical experience with a few basic alterations, the theory will be much easier to digest. If I say, chakra agitation, what does that really mean to you? If I can point to the specific feeling you get from changing a particular hand seal in a jutsu, or in multiple variations, you can know exactly what I'm talking about, and even attempt to add that agitation without altering the hand seals. You may have heard of elemental affinities. My advice is to forget everything you've heard about them until now. There is an appalling lack of understanding and a multitude of terrible ideas that even Junin who should know what they are talking about perpetuate. You will find one of the elements to be easier to manipulate than the others, but it will be a very subtle thing for a long time yet. Ignoring other elements because of your affinity is a common mistake and a terrible response to learning your affinity. It is true that you will eventually end up focusing on your affinity to advance your ability, and given that it takes years of training to use advanced elemental manipulation even for your strongest affinity, you will likely end up training only one of elements you aren't aligned with to that level if you decide to put in the effort. This does not mean you cannot learn elemental techniques of elements you aren't aligned with, and it certainly doesn't mean it isn't worth the bother. There is plenty you can do without advanced elemental manipulation, and playing around with all the elements is essential if you ever wish to choose a second element to train in. I applaud you if you stuck around this long, as by now I'm sure you know that the approach to ninjutsu in this book is a lifelong commitment. You may think that this isn't for you, or you may be absolutely certain that it is. Here is the way to test that. The way to test whether or not this was something he was suited to was Kawarimi no Jutsu. Or rather, a version of the Kawarimi that had 27 hand seals, and not just the standard 12. All but 3 of the hand seals from the new version were from what the book described as the first expansion set, which contained 80 new hand seals. Some were familiar, like the specialized clone seal he used for Kage Bunshin and a few that were slight variations on the standard zodiac. Others were completely new, and worse still were quite a few that required near painful contortions of his fingers. 27 seals was absolutely worthless for a practical Kawarimi, so it was a good thing that it wasn't supposed to be used in battle. All you did with it was practice. Apparently, the 5-seal Kawarimi was a bastardized version of the true Kawarimi. Any jutsu that was designed with any sort of complex theory couldn't really be developed with just the standard zodiac seals. They were developed with the first and second expansion sets, and then compressed down to more workable seal sets. Most jutsu evolved continuously as ninja made slight alterations, but the really groundbreaking stuff was esoteric and generally not used until compressed. Sometimes it was a matter of expediency. Kawurimi was an emergency jutsu. You couldn't stand there for 15 seconds trying to contort your fingers through unwieldy seals that were far too varied. You needed something quick with familiar and easy to transition hand positions. So the 5-seal Zodiac version did the trick. It was inferior to the expanded versions in almost every way, but how quickly it could be used. It was disorienting. It required a very firm understanding of the relative position of what you were trying to replace yourself with. The more the difference between your mass and your targets, the harder it was and the worse the backlash and disorientation was, and that was on an exponential scale. So the book said to practice with the expanded versions a lot, and then try to make the chakra flow the same way with the compressed version. It recommended starting out with just the expansion that reduced disorientation and focus on that. It also warned that this wouldn't have a quick payoff, and that was why it was a test. If you could stick through it for months before getting any progress, and then you actually felt like the progress you were making was worth all the effort, then you were probably suited to really mastering ninjutsu, as opposed to just getting pretty good with the ones you knew. Naruto wasn't deterred. The more the book talked about how much work and how hard that work would be before you would get anywhere, the more excited he got. The reason? Kage Bunshin, Naruto murmured aloud, practically drooling, his voice dripping with reverence and anticipation previously reserved for Ichiraku's ramen and the color orange. He started chuckling, at first barely more than a rumbling purr in his throat. Foo foo foo, ha ha. Mwahahaha, ow. Naruto's head was slammed into the table as a heavy book cut off his first real, and rather pathetic, attempt at evil laughter. You're in the library, so be quiet. The girl who just rudely bashed his head in hissed at him, leveling a rather forbidding glare on him. Or what would have been forbidding had it not been for the thick circular glasses and unkempt blonde hair. Sorry, Naruto apologized, more out of habit than any real contrition. He was no stranger to people inflicting head trauma on him when he got irritating. The girl stalked off, apparently satisfied. Spoil sport, he grumbled when she was out of sight. Didn't anybody realize that sound effects were an essential part of studying? Refocusing himself, he went back to his book. For now, he had more studying to do. It was an odd, warbling and utterly painful-sounding moan that dragged Naruto out from the depths of his sleep. Shut up and go away, Naruto commanded, rolling over to try and get some more sleep. Well, that's what he intended to happen. What came out of his mouth instead was shmmrghwa. Yuga, as several unpleasant facts suddenly made themselves known. The distressing sound that had awoken him was something he had been making, which thankfully cut off as he attempted to speak. More importantly, there were thousands of evil ninja bees buzzing inside his head and stinging his brain repeatedly. An even more disturbing moan wrenched itself painfully from his throat as he curled up into the fetal position, trying to figure out why everything hurt so much and his pillow tasted like dirt. Sensei, I think he's dying. I shall take him to the hospital. Someone shouted with far too much enthusiasm. End volume. The curled-up blonde groaned as the ninja bees in his head decided they'd been going too easy on him. Naruto opened his eyes slightly, and when the light didn't burn them out or make his head feel any worse, he grudgingly sat up, mentally berating himself for falling asleep in a training field before turning his attention to the boy next to him. His intention to reassure the kind, if loud, would-be Samaritan that he was not dying was blasted away by a kind of surreal shock. Crouched down beside him was a boy with 2 mutant caterpillars posing as his eyebrows. Were it not for the earnest and concerned look on the face attached to the caterpillars, as they were clearly too significant to be considered attached to the face, Naruto might have freaked out. The abnormally round eyes, bowl cut, and green spandex had an oddly calming effect. Clearly, this caterpillar-human hybrid hadn't learned how to properly blend in with regular society yet, and it would not be able to hide its dastardly. Naruto shook his head to halt that clearly out-of-control train of thought. Seeing those eyebrows first thing after waking up had obviously been detrimental to his thought processes. Unfortunately for his peace of mind, that brought his attention to a second caterpillar-human hybrid. He nearly choked on his tongue as scrambled backwards a few feet in alarm. Gay, they're multiplying. What? The younger one asked, cocking his head to one side in puzzlement. It was now clear to him what must have happened the previous night to make him pass out here instead of in his relatively comfortable bed. He must have drunk a massive amount of alcohol and then ate a handful of those hallucinogenic mushrooms that Iruka-sensei had warned to stay well away from. The caterpillar twins could just be the last traces of that stuff in his system. Naruto frowned and shook his head a little again as he stood, hoping to clear his mind a little. Something about these two was screwing with his sense of reality. "Sorry about that," he said genuinely. "You two caught me off guard and I'm still a bit out of it." He rolled his shoulder a bit, trying to get the ache from sleeping awkwardly on it out. "Think nothing of it," the older one said, a beaming smile on his face. "Our youthful exuberance is surely stunning to witness for the first time." If by youthful exuberance you mean giant eyebrows and stunning is code for unnerving, then yeah, Naruto thought, that's it exactly. At least they can't get any weirder. Of course, Sensei chose that moment to give a vigorous thumbs up, a broad smile, and a wink. And then his teeth went pink, flashing as though the sun was glaring off them for a moment. Which didn't make sense, as the sun hadn't even properly risen yet. "Sensei!" Lee shouted happily. Whether it was in response to the praise or the pose, Naruto didn't know, and he didn't want to know. He rolled his tight shoulder again, more to hide his discomfort with the pinging and the shouting than to relieve any pain. "Ah, how rude of me," Sensei said inexplicably. "Allow me to help you with that." Before Naruto could allow or disallow or even think about what the odd man meant, he was right beside Naruto, a steely grip on the boy's shoulder. "What are you doing?" Huh? Naruto's panicked question was cut short as the older man made a quick twisting motion with the boy's arm. He gave the start of a scream as he felt and heard a crackling pop, but before he could build up any volume he realized that it didn't hurt. In fact, it felt a lot better. It's rude to not suddenly manhandle somebody's arm? Naruto thought a bit incredulously, although without any anger. He moved his arm around, marveling the lack of pain. If he could learn how to do that, Kage Bunshin would have another awesome use. His thoughts took an inevitable but slightly disturbing turn. Would it be weird if I got a massage from a Kage Bunshin? Would it be more creepy or less creepy if the clone was using Oiroke no Jutsu? He shuddered and concluded that it would definitely be more creepy. Stop thinking about it, stop thinking about it, stop thinking about it, damn it. That was pretty cool, Naruto said, deciding to leave the philosophical debate on the creepiness of self-massages for another time. Thanks, Shinobi-san. You are most welcome, and you may call me Guy. And I am Rock Lee, Konoha's beautiful green wild beast. Lee chimed in, copying the thumbs-up winking pose his teacher had shown earlier. His teeth went pink too. "Lee, what a beautiful introduction of youth." Guy bellowed the last word jubilantly, his eyes shining brightly. "I must introduce myself properly, following the wonderful example set forth by beloved student." There was a burst of smoke that obscured the man briefly. "I am Konoha's sublime green beast of prey, Maida Guy." The smoke cleared to reveal Guy standing in the most ridiculous pose Naruto had ever seen. One arm was held straight up, the palm positioned as though he were a waiter holding a tray. The other hand was in an upside-down, okay, sign, the circle over his eye and the fingers on his cheek. Oh, and he was standing on a bored-looking giant turtle. That almost didn't register. Oddly enough, Naruto couldn't help but be more amused than freaked out this time. He supposed the part of his brain that dealt with crap like this by shouting "this is so weird" might have protested being abusively overworked by going on strike. His headache had been steadily disappearing since he woke up and was almost gone, and the resulting good mood might have contributed to how well he was taking this. Guy and Lee were pretty weird, but they were also really friendly. The poses and the titles were over the top and kooky, but in a fun way. Weird, but fun. Something about their all-out enthusiasm made him want to respond in kind. Naruto's stealth formed a Kage Bunshin about 10 meters to his 10 o'clock. He couldn't help but feel pride in how far he'd advanced from just yesterday. He'd half-assed the seal and only had in the right position for an instant in order to hide the fact that he was actually doing it, but he'd still managed to produce a clone at range and out of sight behind some bushes. That was way beyond what he could do before spending time exploring what he could do with the jutsu. Naruto decided to make his title simple. He'd had experience with things sounding way cooler in his head than out loud, and he wasn't going to get the chance to test it out verbally beforehand. Right as he opened his mouth he changed his mind. These two had been making complete fools of themselves pretty much the entire time he'd known them, which amounted to a less than impressive total of less than 5 minutes, but still. The funny thing was that he didn't really think the less of them for it. They weren't ashamed of their weirdness. No, their uniqueness in the slightest. They seemed to revel in it. Once again Naruto felt an unvoiced, unintended challenge. If they could do it, then so could he. Well, at least with these guys. Just following whatever whim that passed through his mind might make Sakura-chan think he was weird, and that would suck. I am Uzumaki Naruto, he stated imperiously, standing as tall and proud as he could. Konoha's majestic orange maelstrom, and its future Hokage. A breeze wafted through, swirling leaves around him and caressing his hair for a moment and flaring his jacket with what seemed like the most perfect timing ever. That was because it was. The clone he'd created had used one of the basic elemental jutsu that he'd learned from Hiruzen's book the night before. A wind jutsu so generally useless it didn't even have a name. All it did was create a gentle, controllable breeze. One of the things that he was supposed to learn from using the breeze technique was indirect control, guiding things in the air with the breeze. If you were to just blow things around, it was near impossible to have any sort of fine control over where they went, and any control you did learn would just be applicable to wind techniques, but if they were saturated in your chakra you could use chakra resonation to guide them very precisely. You were supposed to start learning with tufts of cotton, but he didn't exactly carry that around, so he just improvised and used leaves. It was probably easier with cotton, but he had chakra and clones to spare. Oddly enough, the leaves actually absorbed chakra and responded significantly better to the technique than the torn-up bits of paper he'd first tried it with. When he'd started out the night before, he'd barely been able to control one leaf, so he was understandably proud of the few dozen that wafted through the air for his introduction. Unfortunately for his coolness factor, he'd overestimated his abilities somewhat. He hadn't had time to saturate the leaves before using the technique, so his clone had needed to imbue chakra into them through the breeze technique, a skill he wasn't quite good at yet. The more chakra in a leaf, the more easily controlled it was. While you could train yourself to need less and less chakra to have the same level of control, he was far from that point. The effect that he'd intended didn't require much control at all. The leaves were just supposed to go by at the appropriate moment to give him a heroic mystique and gravitas. Everything went as planned, except for the part where a few leaves made contact with his head and face. That wouldn't have been too bad if that had been all. It wasn't. One of the leaves got stuck in his nose. Naruto tried to keep his face straight, but he could feel the heat of an atomic blush on his cheeks and one of his eyes was twitching. He reached up and removed the offending leaf as calmly as he could and flicking it away. Looking at the way Lee's mouth was twitching, it was clear he was holding in laughter. With a sigh of resignation, Naruto decided that pretending it didn't happen wasn't going to help anything. Go ahead, you can laugh. I know it was funny. If it hadn't been the leaf, it probably would have been the title. He'd probably keep the maelstrom part, if he ever had the guts to introduce himself like that ever again, but he needed a less over-the-top description than majestic orange. Suddenly, Lee wasn't holding back the urge to laugh anymore. Strangely enough, it wasn't because he was laughing. Forgive my unyouthfulness, Naruto-kun. Your introduction was splendid. It's fine, Lee-san. The sting of embarrassment was all but gone. Had something like that happened at the academy, he would have been a laughingstock for a week, but Lee was just so genuinely friendly that something like a botched attempt at being cool just didn't seem like a big deal. It probably helped that the other boy was unashamedly weird. Wonderfully said Lee. Guy boomed delightedly, smiling proudly at his student. Naruto-kun's introduction was certainly splendid. I'm sure it would have been ever better if he were in top condition. His tone and demeanor abruptly changed in a way that reminded Naruto somewhat of Iruka-sensei during a lecture. A good night's sleep in a bed rejuvenates your flames of youth 10 times better than sleeping on the ground. I completely empathize with the desire to train from the instant you awake, but you must take better care of yourself, Naruto-kun. Lee had taken out a notepad when Guy assumed his lecture mode, and was scribbling along as his teacher talked. Then, sleeping on the ground, the boy muttered while writing. He saw Naruto's curiosity. Words of wisdom should be recorded and passed down, he explained. Naruto didn't have the heart to tell him that most people wouldn't consider the fact that beds were more comfortable to sleep on than the ground something profound enough to bother writing down. On some level he understood Lee's feelings. If he actually knew Hiruzen, chances were he'd have the same kind hero worship that Lee had for Guy. Not to the extent that he'd be willing to dress in green spandex. Orange maybe, but not green. Nor would he be so inspired to hear that beds were nice. I didn't mean to fall asleep here, Naruto explained. He got the feeling that leaving Guy with the impression that he was so eager to train that he slept in training fields could turn out spectacularly bad. I kinda went overboard practicing Kawarimi last night. And trying to throw myself around like a shuriken probably didn't help. The part about the shuriken was mostly just thinking aloud as a reaction to the memory. Given the way he'd managed to knock himself out, his recollection was a bit jumbled, but it was all coming back to him as he thought about it. Like a shuriken? Lee mimed the motion, clearly baffled as to how it could be used to throw oneself around. Is that a riddle? I'm not very good with those. Actually, don't tell me, Lee interrupted quickly. I can figure this out. He was shifting through positions that looked like preparation to jump and spin, frowning at each one when he decided it wasn't going to work. This is like that pull yourself up by your bootstraps thing I haven't figured out yet. Aha, it's really not, Naruto tried to explain, but Lee wasn't listening. Referring to bootstraps had inspired him to try and throw himself by grabbing his own foot. It was a comically outlandish idea. But the truly amazing thing was that throughout his contortions he never lost his balance. Even as he tried odder and odder positions, adding hops and spins to try and fling himself around the clearing, he remained bizarrely graceful. He never stumbled or seemed even the tiniest bit out of control. Except for mentally, of course. It took a surprisingly short time for Green-clad Boy to actually appear to be throwing himself by yanking his feet. He switched which foot he was trying it with every couple of jumps, in odd directions. He was even trying out different kinds of spins, flips, spinny flips, and flippy spins, somehow two different things. That seemed to defy the laws of physics. And reality. The heights he jumped to, the number of rotations, and the sheer impossibility of someone throwing themselves around by their own leg was something Naruto could barely believe even when it was happening right in front of him. How wonderful. Guy crowed delightedly as he joined his student in the air. Lee's acrobatics were impressive beyond anything Naruto had ever seen before, but his teacher was even more physically adept. He hadn't needed any practice to copy Lee's movements, and from the first leap was already surpassing them physically, artistically, and in overall weirdness. On the one hand, Guy and Lee were utterly and freakily weird. On the other, Naruto couldn't help being envious of their skills. Guy had started to bounce off trees like a demented green pinball, intermittently shouting, "Yosh!" That's completely different from what I meant. Naruto wasn't going to say anything at this point since it looked like they were having way too much fun to care. My way of throwing myself around is going to be much cooler. Naruto thought petulantly. Once I actually figure out a way to make it work. His training the night before had been mostly amazing, although not everything had gone perfectly. He'd been far too excited to go to sleep after reading the Fundamentals of Ninjutsu book, barely even daring to hope that it was as awesome as he thought it was. It was torture, but he forced himself to start out with chakra control instead of going straight for the jutsu. The leaf concentration exercise was as frustrating as he remembered. Between the Kage Bunshin and the book's instructions, he hoped to actually get somewhere with it this time. When Iruka-sensei had taught the exercise to the class years ago, it had been one of Naruto's most perplexing failures. It had been incredibly difficult to get the leaf to stick to his forehead, and doing pretty much anything caused it to blow off. He had to be completely relaxed and not thinking about anything but just the feeling his chakra on his forehead. A stray thought, too much concentration, a loud noise, anything messed him up. His record had been 6 seconds. Nobody else in his class had that kind of problem. The leaf just fell off if they lost concentration, and for everyone else there was not such a thing as being too concentrated. At first he thought it was cool. No one else could propel the leaf away from them, so that had to be cool. And then it became obvious that he wasn't getting any better at the part that apparently mattered, no matter how much he practiced. He'd thought it would be funny to try and launch leaves at Sasuke, which didn't quite work, but it did get him told off by Iruka-sensei for being intentionally disruptive. The teacher didn't take him seriously when he complained about concentrating too much, and after reprimanding Naruto he decided that the boy was making a nuisance of himself on purpose rather than actually trying to concentrate properly. They'd moved on to the basic academy jutsu not long after, and his relative success with Henge and Kawarimi meant that his continued lack of progress with the exercise didn't become a lasting issue, at least as far as his grades were concerned. He'd kept at it on his own for about another couple of months, but the fact that it seemed to get even harder with all the effort he was putting into it resulted in him spending less and less time trying until he wrote it off as a lost cause. Kage Bunshin had given him hope of erasing that painful failure. He didn't really think that having 10 clones doing the same thing would help him learn 10 times faster, but he was hoping that there was some benefit. If 10 clones helped him learn even 10% faster, then it was something he was going to make full use of. Clones were cheap, after all. Naruto's impatient nature had actually ended up being beneficial for once. He hadn't been expecting to get anywhere fast with the leaf concentration, and the tree walking exercise just sounded too damn cool to wait for. So he'd had a significant number of clones trying that out at the same time rather than wait for progress with the supposedly easier leaf exercise. Even with 50 clones doing the leaf exercise, none of them were getting anywhere. However, one of the 15 clones he'd assigned to the tree walking exercise had managed to get far up enough a tree that a botched fall had done enough damage to force it to dispel about a half hour in. The memories of the clone had transferred the real Naruto, and every other living clone. The clone that had died had managed to get about 3 feet farther up a tree than any other clone, and suddenly every other tree climber experienced a small but noticeable improvement. That had been most apparent in the clones that were running up trees at the time of the first clone death. They could actually feel the improvement mid-climb. The tree climbing clones had realized the implications rather quickly and all dispelled themselves, which resulted in the leaf concentration clones dispelling as they too realized that it could help. There was a brief period of dizziness caused by the influx of information, but it only lasted a few seconds. It was something to take note of, but given that it was something like 30 of 40 hours worth of experience, it wasn't really surprising or concerning. The next batch of clones had certainly proven the use of the Kage Bunshin. He'd been slightly but noticeably better at the leaf concentration exercise, but it was the tree climbing exercise that had been the most improved. The first clone that had dispelled had gotten around 20 feet up the tree when it had fallen and died. All of the new clones had managed just above 30 feet on their first try, a full 10-foot gain over the best individual accomplishment. That meant the combined experience of clones was actually worth a great deal. It had taken some experimentation to find what felt like the most effective method, and he was sure that if he kept at it he could refine it even more. He settled on having a clone dispel itself if it felt like it had learned something unique, sharing its experience with its brothers and creator. The more he practiced the technique, the easier it was for a clone to figure out when it had learned something worth sharing. It also became clear that any clone that dispelled itself returned most of its remaining chakra to him, whereas those that were dispelled not of their own will only return a portion. It was difficult to tell exactly how much, but Naruto would guess between half and 3/4. Between the chakra returned from the clones and his own natural recovery rate, the only real cost was the strain from getting the memories of several clones per minute. It wasn't debilitating, but it did build up over the few hours that it took to become comfortable with tree walking. About a half-hour's break in which he read Fundamentals of Ninjutsu had proven enough rest to return to training. By that point Naruto was more than convinced that the book was the real deal, and he was eager to start doing new stuff. Walking on trees was awesome, but there was so much more that he wanted to get to. He'd left a few clones to keep practicing tree walking and the leaf concentration exercise, because mastery is a never-ending road, and then created 4 more groups. 2 of the groups had worked on Kawarimi. The smaller one was just trying to memorize the 27 hand seals and get to the point where they could actually run through them. The other group was working on the expansion that just reduced disorientation. It only had 7 seals, but 4 of them were weird new ones. Another group worked on learning the gentle breeze technique, because that was what he was supposed to start learning alterations with. That group would go on to work on indirect control through chakra resonation once it learned the technique. The last group had been given the task of getting creative with henge. The book had advocated understanding everything you know because all techniques were more versatile than their common uses. He'd had to look up versatile in the dictionary, but it sounded like good advice. He was already using Kage Bunshin a lot, so getting to know that was going to happen naturally. The book had him learning about the ins and outs of Kawarimi rather exhaustively, so that had been covered. That only left Henge. Without the book telling him what he should be working at, he'd been left with a bit of a quandary, and it had taken quite a while to come up with anything that even seemed plausible. Sure, turning into a tiger or growing a set of wings to try and fly sounded cool but didn't exactly work out in practice. He didn't magically gain a tiger's musculature, so even though he looked like a tiger walking around was more than a little awkward. The wings had a similar problems. The most he could get them to do was twitch. It wasn't as though the practice was useless. He'd learned a lot about Henge's limits, getting better at it himself, and found even more interesting things about Cage Bunshin. Clones could use Henge better than he could. It was a bit odd, but he figured the fact that they were just chakra constructs in the first place meant that changing their physical shape came a bit easier for them. The closest he'd come to a practical new application for the Henge that night was Cage Bunshins turned into weapons. It certainly wasn't even close to usable, but it had potential. There were definite mass limits, and it could be that all the chakra control and practice in the world wouldn't allow him to make something even as small as a katana. And what use was a weapon that would dispel on contact if it lost its concentration? Despite all that, Naruto was sure that a sentient weapon was something worth pursuing. He just had to get better at Henge and Cage Bunshin and see if anything he learned later might help out with that. There was one aspect that seemed like it could work out, and not in a 10 years down the line sort of way. One of his brilliant clones, they were all him, therefore all brilliant in his mind, had gotten the idea to turn into a Fuma shuriken like the one Mizuki had used. It had taken some practice in order to manage one small enough to be thrown, but he'd been sure that he'd had a breakthrough on that. It was not to be. The hanged clone was aware enough of its surroundings that the intense spinning motion made it incredibly dizzy and it dropped the henge almost immediately and dispelled as it crashed into the ground. Naruto had not been deterred. The clones worked on reducing their awareness and maintaining their concentration within the technique, and eventually, after a lot of second-hand dizziness, managed to hold the transformation indefinitely. The problem was what to do after that. The point of the technique wasn't to avoid the costs of buying Fuma shuriken. It was the whole flying through the air bit that was interesting. Even having gotten the holding the henge through intense spinning down, he'd been left with the release. The clone came out of the transformation spinning as fast as it had been as the shuriken, leaving it utterly incapable of doing anything except crashing into something and dying. Naruto had no ideas at all on how to get around that, so he'd set it aside for the time being. The way he'd trained with the clones was constantly changing throughout the night. All the clones had Naruto's personality and memories, so they certainly weren't capable of working non-stop without distraction. The training had started out with each clone just doing its own thing, trying to complete its assigned task. Then the clones started interacting. They'd talked to one another, socialized, and even goofed around a bit. Naruto hadn't been terribly amused by two clones spending 20 minutes playing rock paper scissors, but there was nothing he could do about it after the fact. And any clone that wanted to do something could neatly avoid punishment by dispelling. Naruto had never been very good at doing what he was told, so how could he expect so many copies of him to be perfectly obedient drones? He hadn't put a stop to it because there didn't seem to be a point, and also it was pretty nice. He got on really well with himself, and it was like he was hanging out and training with a bunch of friends. It hadn't taken him long to see that it was actually beneficial to his training as well. Clones that had fun and were relaxed transferred the memories and feelings to all the other clones when they dispelled, keeping those that were training from getting bored, and it even reduced the real Naruto's mental strain. From then on, he'd added a group of clones whose job was just to have fun, and let the training clones interact and bounce ideas off one another. That wasn't to say there weren't any hiccups. Two clones had gotten into a heated argument over ramen of all things. Forcefully dispelling them had revealed they didn't have differing opinions, which would have been really freaky, but had misunderstood each other in exactly the same way. It had been rather embarrassing. The clones had been getting rather good at using kawarimi on each other, as the practicality of allowing a clone to take a hit in his place was rather obvious. It had been difficult at first, but they'd certainly been motivated. Experimentation with kawarimi ended up with 5 clones deciding that it would be brilliant to find out what would happen if tried to swap themselves in a circle. A would use kawarimi on B, B on C, C on D, D on E, and E on A, all at the same time. Had they bounced this idea off other clones, they might have gotten the idea to try having just two clones swap with each other first. But A through E had been best buddies their entire lives, all 20 minutes of them. And talking about it outside their own little clique didn't even occur to them. They'd make this incredible discovery together. It was possible that things might have gone better had they used the long version of the Kawarimi, or at the very least the version that just reduced chakra backlash, but the original 5-seal version had been the easiest to coordinate. So they'd counted down and used the technique with no regard for the consequences. In their minds, either something awesome would happen or nothing would happen at all. The 5 simultaneous techniques had strained at cross purposes, building up energy as they tried to execute themselves. A visible aura of roiling chakra had flickered up around the surprised clones, none of whom had any idea how to stop it. Something snapped and they started swapping places randomly several times a second each. It had only taken a few seconds for the chakra backlash to completely overwhelm the clones' chakra systems, tearing them apart in an explosion of energy. The memories of the 5 clones' botched technique had caused every other clone to be disrupted, and the memories of all the clones plus the traumatic death of the 5 had slammed Naruto into unconsciousness. It had been a sobering experience. Naruto felt lucky to be alive, and made a mental promise to be much more careful experimenting, even with Kage Bunshin as a safety buffer. Despite the frightening experience, he couldn't help but feel a bit excited. Whatever had happened with the Kawarimi, there had been something profound. He was going to stay well away from trying that again until he had a theory about why it had happened and had reduced the chakra backlash from the technique as far as he could. This is just the start, Naruto thought to himself, his determination almost a palpable thing. One day I'll know everything about jutsu. Naruto was startled out of his thoughts as Lee came down out of spin to try and kick a training post near him. The kick clipped the post rather than hitting it dead on, but still managed to gouge a chunk of the wood with such force that it splintered out as sawdust. "Watch it," Naruto complained as the wood nearly hit him, even as he marveled at the power of the kick. He wondered what would have happened to the post had it taken a direct hit. "I'm sorry, Naruto-kun," Lee said, swaying and stumbling a bit. "I appear to be unyouthfully dizzy." He brought out his notepad again and started writing and muttering. "Throwing yourself around like a shuriken makes you dizzy." Guy jumped down beside Lee, not looking dizzy in slightest despite his more extreme acrobatics. "You must train yourself to overcome the dizziness, Lee. Anything can be done with the power of youth." "Sensei, Yash," Lee exclaimed, "if in 1 week I have not trained myself not to get dizzy, I shall backflip around Konoha 10 times while blindfolded. And if you can't do that, I shall fling myself like a shuriken all the way to Kumo and back without stopping." "Sensei, Lee, Sensei, Lee, Naruto-kun." Naruto hopped back a step in surprise, desperately hoping he wouldn't have to join in, whatever this was. "Lee-san? Naruto-kun," Lee said happily. "Thank you for sharing your youthful training exercise with us. It's way more your exercise than mine," Naruto explained, relieved that he hadn't been drawn too far into the back and forth of names. "There's no way I'd be able to pull that stuff off." Naruto thought he might have said something he shouldn't have as he saw the fire in Guy's eyes. "Then you shall join us in our training to bring out your flames of youth." "Sensei, Lee, Naruto-kun, shit, well, there we have it. I had more planned, but that seemed like the definitive end to the chapter. There's a ton of foreshadowing and hints as to Naruto's development in here. Guy and Lee pretty much came out of nowhere. I wanted to keep this chapter from just being a boring info dump on Naruto's training, and somehow they hijacked the plot in the process. I had very different plans for when Naruto would first meet Lee and what it would mean. This actually has quite a large effect on the plot. They are a bit hard to write, and I had a hard time trying to figure out where to put all the youth s and the yash s. I hope the characterization turned out okay. Naruto meeting 2 of the friendliest and most genuine people in the entire series this early is going to affect how he connects with everyone else. Particularly Sasuke and Kakashi. Canon Naruto hungers for acknowledgement and friendship, and he becomes rather focused on Sasuke and to a lesser extent Kakashi for validation. When Sasuke starts acknowledging Naruto, it's at the expense of any friendship they might have, and that dynamic was something I planned to explore. Having said that, I can't go that route anymore. Guy and Lee just click way too well with Naruto's determination to disregard, And with Lee's obvious combat superiority over Sasuke plus the fact that he's actually willing to be friendly is going to change Naruto's interaction with Sasuke a lot. Things should pick up after this. Next chapter should at least get through team selection. Edit. These footnotes will seem odd, as I've removed the numberings from the story content because they were breaking immersion. The pose on the turtle. Guy does this pose when he introduces himself right after Lee kicks Sasuke's ass before the Chunin exam. Iruka dismissing Naruto's issues with the leaf concentration exercise as tomfoolery. Iruka wasn't being mean. He simply had no idea how to teach an Uzumaki Jinchuriki. Using henge to turn into a shuriken, in canon that seemed to be such a simple bit of cleverness. But the more I thought about it, the less I could just leave it be. Thinking about how that henge must work in order for it to be that easy makes it pretty much like magic, and I don't want to just shove that under a rug and say, "Tada. Awesome technique. Naruto, what the hell are you doing here? Showing up and pretending you graduated is a stupid plan, ya know?" Naruto glared balefully at Kiba, tapping his forehead protector meaningfully. "See this? It means I'm a ninja." He put his head back on his arms, clearly dismissing the Inuzuka, who huffed before walking away. Naruto was glad that it had been that easy, as he hadn't quite figured out what to say if anyone asked how he graduated. The Mizuki incident had been classified. Shikamaru, sitting to the blonde's left, narrowed his eyes in contemplation for a moment as he noted the wear and tear on Naruto's new protector before deciding it wasn't worth the effort to figure out what was going on. So what if he'd never seen Naruto looking even remotely tired, or deliberately sit in the back to try and catch some sleep? It wasn't his problem. For his part, Naruto was just trying to get in a bit of recovery from his morning training before class. He'd been waking up at 5 in the morning every day for the past week in order to train with Guy and Lee, who'd extended the invitation to do so after running him into the ground the day they'd met. They'd clearly been surprised and delighted when he'd shown up the next morning. It could have been they hadn't expected him to recover enough to train anymore for a few days, or it could be that no one they'd invited to train with them before had ever taken them up on it. With good reason. They were crazy. They were also incredibly fit. The acrobatics inspired by Naruto's careless comment about throwing himself around like a shuriken was merely the tip of the iceberg. They'd had to handicap themselves to give him even a chance of keeping up with them when doing laps around Konoha. It turned out that Lee was still faster than Naruto even when he did his laps on his hands with a boulder twice his size tied to his feet, and Naruto had to take a few breaks over the course of their routine when the burn in his legs became too much to bear. It usually only took a few of Guy and Lee's sped-up laps, as they went faster without him, for the burn to subside enough for him to rejoin them. Lee's physical condition was leagues ahead of Naruto's in almost every way. Naruto sort of had the edge in stamina as his Kyuubi-enhanced recovery was by definition inhuman. Given enough time, he could do thousands of push-ups, but not on one finger with a boulder on his back like Lee could in a quarter of the time. Lee liked boulders a lot. Naruto stood no chance in their spars. Lee completely dominated without expending any effort whatsoever. It was a bit depressing at first, but it quickly became apparent that unlike getting beat on by Sasuke or Kiba, Lee wasn't using his superiority to show off by going all out. He was actually helping Naruto, showing him where he was going wrong by pouncing on his worst openings, overextensions, and other flaws instead of just indiscriminately bulldozing through every defense like he was most certainly capable of. Given that Lee could knock him across a clearing with a lazy backhand, Naruto had plenty of motivation to refine his taijutsu really quickly. Between finally having a sparring partner who didn't delight in the chance to beat the crap out of him and Guy's more formal taijutsu instruction, his skills were growing in leaps and bounds, along with his physical fitness. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he noticed Sakura sidling up to Sasuke several rows in front of him, shoving one of the graduates aside when he failed to automatically clear the way between her and the object of her affection. "Sasuke-kun, can I sit next to you?" she asked, scooting up to him without giving him the chance to answer. Sasuke ignored her, as usual, and she ignored the fact that he was ignoring her in favor of gazing at him adoringly, as usual. He's nothing special, Naruto thought grumpily. Lee could kick his ass blindfolded with both hands and a foot tied behind his back. A couple of clones and even I could take him out now. While ganging up on Sasuke with his clones and beating the crap out of him would be rather satisfying, it probably wouldn't endear him to Sakura-chan very much. He'd managed a lucky kick that had knocked Sasuke out of the ring a couple months back, and she'd been extra scathing to him for weeks. The problem was that he couldn't think of any other way to get her attention. Asking her for dates annoyed her. Giving her flowers annoyed her. Trying to be her friend annoyed her. Asking her for help with homework annoyed her. He'd been excited at the idea of making a jutsu for her. She'd have to find that amazing, wouldn't she? But the best he could come up with was to float sakura blossoms around instead of leaves, so that was a bit of a bust. A week ago Naruto probably would have tried to force a confrontation with Sasuke at this point, but now his minor irritation wasn't nearly enough to motivate him. A large part of the tension between Naruto and Sasuke, at least on Naruto's part, was that Sasuke had been the best. He'd been Naruto's measuring stick. For as long as he'd been in the academy, he'd thought that being better than Sasuke meant something important. Like it would prove his worth to himself and everyone else. After meeting, and more importantly, getting beat up by Lee, it had been clear he had been setting his sights way too low. Being the best in the class just didn't mean much to him anymore. Sasuke was just a big fish in a small pond. Naruto had always hated how everyone seemed to place the brooding bastard on a pedestal, and it galled him to realize that he'd been guilty of the same all along. Sure, Sasuke was more skilled than Naruto in a lot of ways, and for the first time it didn't hurt to admit that even in his head. He'd just keep working on his jutsu, letting Guy and Lee run him ragged with their insane training, and rounding out his skills for his own sake. And if it helped Sakura-chan realize how much more awesome than Sasuke that he'd always been, that was just a bonus. Unfortunately for Naruto's emotional maturity, while his epiphanies took the edge off his jealousy, they didn't grant him complete indifference to Sasuke. He couldn't help giving the bastard the evil eye as Sakura scooted even closer. Glaring at the back of Sasuke's head was interrupted by Iruka-sensei's arrival. The class quieted down as their conditioning to avoid the dreaded demon head no jutsu kicked in. The teacher's eyes scanned the students quickly, pausing as they landed on Naruto's position. The blonde gave a thumbs up, resulting in a smile. He got a new forehead protector, Naruto noticed as Iruka began taking roll. There were a few startled reactions when he got to Naruto's name. Roll was followed by a boring lecture on what it meant now that they were all genin. But fortunately for Naruto, 5 massage clones popping had mellowed him out. His squeamishness at the idea of giving himself massages had quickly been thrown aside after the second day of insane training with Guy and Lee. While it was most effective to also have the real him massaged right before the clones popped, even just the transferred experience physically relaxed his muscles. The memories of 15 clones having gotten massaged after a day of hard training was a heavenly way to send himself to sleep. Represent the village with professionalism, teams of 3, learn vital skills, blah blah blah. MMMMH, this table is comfortable. Maybe 5 relaxation clones was a bit too much. Iruka eventually got past all the boring stuff and to the team assignments. Team 7 is Uzumaki Naruto, Haruno Sakura. Naruto gave voice to his joy at this development. He was still riding the mellow from his massages, so it didn't quite convey his enthusiasm properly. He lazily raised his arm, sporting a thumbs up. He was spending too much time with Guy and Lee. And his yay came out rather casual and barely audible over the sound of Sakura's dismayed groan. She doesn't have to sound quite so disappointed, Naruto pouted mentally as he waited for Iruka to announce their third teammate. The third wheel, so to speak. Anybody but Sasuke, he prayed fervently. After a few seconds it became clear that Iruka wasn't continuing. So Naruto lifted his head off of his seemingly comfortable desk to see what the hold-up was. Iruka and the rest of the class were looking at him with unnerving intensity, clearly baffled by something. "Is there something on my face?" Naruto asked nervously, self-consciously wiping a hand across his mouth. It would be embarrassing if there was a ramen noodle hanging off his mouth or nose. "No," Iruka-sensei said carefully. "You're just more quiet than usual." "Ah," Naruto said in comprehension. They didn't know what to make of his newfound zen, and clearly the class just wasn't the same without his liveliness. He'd reassure them that he could still be counted on to be the life of the party when his zen wore off. "I'm trying out silent exclamation marks to see if they taste any better." "What the hell did I just say?" Naruto asked himself, as the looks he was receiving got even more incredulous. A clone that had shirked its duties to go and experiment with mixing instant ramen with random stuff had popped at the same time as another clone in the library had been killed by that blonde girl with glasses he couldn't stop messing with, resulting in an odd influx of memories that shorted out his brain-mouth filter. Maybe sneakily swapping all her cryptography references with Icha when she dropped her pen had been going a little too far. Bashing his clone's head in with an encyclopedia was a bit of an excessive response though. I have no idea what to say to that, Iruka-sensei admitted after an awkward pause. Moving on, your third teammate is Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto groaned, letting his head fall back down with a painful thud as Sakura squealed happily. You still can't do the leaf concentration exercise? Sakura asked incredulously. Naruto sighed exasperatedly as his concentration shattered and the leaf fell off his forehead. It had taken an hour for her to get bored enough of trying to talk with an unresponsive Sasuke to turn her attention to him, and then only to mock him. I can, he protested. Just not very well. That's why I'm working on it. How could they even let you graduate? Sakura continued bitingly. In fact, didn't you fail? Did you bribe Iruka-sensei or something? Sasuke and in a way that sounded suspiciously like a fraction of a laugh. I passed, Naruto said sharply, not happy with the way the conversation was going. There were just some issues with the clone technique. Sakura giggled as she remembered Naruto's previous attempts at the least difficult of the academy jutsu. Issues? Is that what you call it? He resisted the urge to growl. Sakura apparently deemed the conversation over and went back to bugging Sasuke. This team was a nightmare for him, the worst possible combination imaginable. To have Sakura-chan so close, yet so far away was pure torture. She barely even noticed he was there unless Sasuke was doing something less interesting than breathing. He'd tried in vain to talk to her when everyone else had left the three of them in the room, but an annoyed Sakura had made it clear that interrupting her very one-sided conversation with Sasuke wasn't going to be tolerated. After it became clear that their sensei was running late, Naruto had given up on conversation. He'd even tried to talk to Sasuke, but no luck there either, in favor of working on the chakra control exercise. Sitting still and doing nothing just wasn't something he was capable of. Whoever their sensei was had better have a damn good reason for not showing up on time. Naruto was missing out on valuable training time. He'd refreshed the 50 or so clones he had working on taijutsu over lunch, but his training options were irritatingly limited when his real body wasn't involved. Without the ability to continually replace clones, he had to diversify his training so as not to have a bunch of inefficient overlap. Technically, having each clone working on something different seemed the most efficient use of them in theory, but being able to focus on one or two things felt better. The slight differences of each clone's experience combined to give a fuller understanding of each aspect of whatever he was working on, and the sheer speed of progress was exhilarating. It was like he could feel himself getting stronger by the minute. The training method he was using now was actually something Guy-sensei had helped him come up with when he found out that Naruto's idea of hard work was using hundreds of clones at a time. A quarter of the clones were practicing exactly one part of a kata, a specific strike or movement with no two clones doing the same thing, and another quarter was observing to point out any mistakes in form. The last half was paired off doing partnered attack and defense exercises. This way Naruto could cram hundreds of hours of muscle memory training into each day. After they had all dispelled and shared their experience, the next step would be to have a group going the whole kata a bunch of times to smooth over the transitions. That was supposed to be paired with physical training in order to condition his body, but he was stuck here waiting. Or was he? Naruto had been resisting the urge to leave a shadow clone in his place since about 20 minutes after Iruka had taken off, leaving the three of them as the only people in the room. The thought that their sensei was only running a little late and would be there any minute had restrained him at first, but his excitement at meeting his new sensei and the desire to do so in person had all but disappeared. You three are pretty boring. Kakashi didn't have to antagonize his new students within seconds of them first laying eyes on him, but the looks of indignation on their faces were even more rewarding than he could have hoped for. In his defense, it was kind of the truth. They could have used the hours preceding his arrival to socialize, getting used to the idea that they'd be on a team together. The brief glimpse of their body language before they'd noticed him entering the classroom had made it abundantly clear they hadn't made productive use of their time together, although Naruto had at least been trying to train his chakra control, however ineffectively. The boy's massive reserves meant that he'd need to start out with far more chakra-intensive exercises to get anywhere. In an ideal world, Naruto would have been receiving training since he was old enough to walk. Kakashi had been eagerly anticipating training his sensei's son, but despite having the support of the Hokage's advisors, some major clan heads, and even Shimura Danzo, the Sandaime had told him that Naruto wasn't to be trained yet, and that was the end of it. It had made no sense to Kakashi. Uzumaki Naruto was the worst-kept S-rank secret in the history of the elemental nations. The citizens of Konoha had found out within hours of the sealing, and the other countries within days. His blonde hair and blue eyes had to scream, "Namikaze," when coupled with the sealing, and the Sandaime was going to let him grow up like just another orphan, dangling him in sight of anybody who might want to kidnap a Jinchuriki or kill Namikaze Minato's child. But the deluge of kidnappers and assassins that Kakashi knew had to be coming never arrived. The other countries seemed even more confused by the Sandaime leaving Naruto out in the open than Kakashi was. There had been token attempts, but nothing that could be termed serious was attempted by any of the major hidden villages. They'd mostly been content to test the security around Naruto every once in a while, and even that had dropped off by the time Naruto had turned about 6 or 7. Although relieved, Kakashi had been utterly baffled by the intelligence reports he'd managed sneak looks into during those early years. Within a week of the sealing, Iwa had decided that Naruto was a tongue-in-cheek red herring. They'd been certain from day one that there was no way he could be a real Uzumaki, not with blonde hair. Initially there had been some uncertainty as to whether or not he could be the son of the Yondaime, his hair and eye color being too conspicuous to ignore, but the Sandaime leaving him in the open had made them think that rather unlikely. When Naruto entered the academy years later, his cringe-worthy academic performance reduced unlikelihood to impossibility in the Tsuchikage's opinion. Iwa became convinced that the real Jinchuriki was hidden away somewhere and Naruto was just a red herring or a trap, that Sarutobi was thumbing his nose at Onoki, just daring him to try something. They still kept an eye on the boy, but it was more that they didn't know what to make of him than any definitive interest, and far more resources were spent trying to find the non-existent, real, Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. Kumo had been the next greatest threat to Naruto in Kakashi's mind, but they too had decided that making an attempt on the boy wasn't worth the risk, which had come as a surprise considering how aggressively they pursued assets as a matter of policy. Their conclusions about Naruto had been more dangerous and unsettling than Iwa's. They'd rejected the Uzumaki heritage for the same reason that Iwa had, but they hadn't written it off as a transparent ploy. They'd managed to sneak a censor nin in to evaluate Naruto when he was only a few years old, an event that Konoha hadn't found out about until several years after the fact. Even as a toddler, Naruto's chakra was far too developed to go unnoticed. Sealing a demon was never a simple task, and never before had it been done with so little as a few hours preparation. Such a venture was usually planned months if not years in advance, so Kumo was of the opinion that Naruto was quite likely a Jinchuriki, but a defective one, the demon sealed too tightly to be of any use. Even being a Jinchuriki didn't come close to explaining Naruto's ridiculous reserves, especially as even the most experienced censor couldn't detect a hint of non-human chakra coming from the boy, and being a demon container didn't usually give more than a 20 to 30% boost in natural reserves with even the most permissive of seals. Any more than that meant the seal was too permeable, and the container wasn't going to survive without debilitating side effects. So Kumo's conclusion was that Konoha had been experimenting on the child, the result of which giving him massive reserves at the cost of any sort of control. Pretending that he was an Uzumaki was just a way of deflecting suspicion if anybody noticed anything unusual about his chakra. All the major ninja villages and a few of the minor ones had experimented with artificially increasing chakra reserves with various degrees of success, but the result was always a failure in the sense that those increased reserves always came at the cost of warped chakra coils that left the subject incapable of being useful except for utilizing their new reserves to overpower suicide jutsu. Anybody with reserves significant enough to bother with the expensive operations involved had to have had enough training to make them 100 times more useful as a ninja than a sentient exploding tag. Kakashi wasn't a censor nin, but he had enough skill in the art to sense for himself that Naruto had a good deal more chakra than he did. The classified reports he'd seen estimated that the boy had just above twice Kakashi's own reserves. That was nothing short of incredible, given that he had trained his reserves to be abnormally high even for his specialization as a ninjutsu master in order to compensate for his implanted Sharingan. The number of Konoha shinobi with more chakra than Kakashi could probably be counted on one hand with fingers left over, and of those only Jiraiya likely had more chakra than Naruto. Although that was a bit of a guess, as the elusive spymaster kept the true extent of his reserves hidden at all times. By the standards of such experiments, Naruto would have been considered a resounding success if only for the fact that he had broken records with the sheer degree to which his chakra would have been enhanced and the fact that he could perform jutsu, even if only in an apparently limited fashion. The idea of trading a Jinchuriki's ability to use jutsu in order to turn them into a bomb was a ridiculous waste to Jinchuriki, so the Raikage could be forgiven for making erroneous conclusion that the hasty sealing had already stripped Naruto's potential as a ninja away to the point where turning him into a suicide bomber wasn't a waste of a potentially S-class ninja anymore. Strangely enough, this left Kumo far more likely to be a danger to Naruto than Iwa, as they actually viewed him as a potential threat. They wouldn't try to kidnap him while they thought he was just a bomb, and given how inefficient suicide jutsu were, there wouldn't be much point assassinating him either, even taking his reserves into account. Very few people were aware of all the important facts when it came to Naruto's heritage and the sealing. If Kakashi didn't know better, he'd have thought it was impossible for things to work out the way they did on accident. Almost everything had come together far too perfectly to be a coincidence. Naruto had been born with an unbelievable advantage. As an Uzumaki, his chakra coils and life force were already extremely strong, and the fact that his mother had been a pureblood Uzumaki meant that he'd been absorbing her potent chakra for 10 months before his birth had boosted that advantage. And then he'd had the Kyuubi sealed in him right after being born, before his system had adjusted to not being able to siphon chakra from Kushina, leaving it in the perfect position to adapt to the Kyuubi. The only thing that could have possibly made Naruto more suited to being a Jinchuriki was if his father had been an Uzumaki as well. The integration of a Biju's chakra with its host system one was generally considered the most important factor when to how useful a Jinchuriki could be as a weapon, and getting the highest possible compatibility between the two was usually the highest priority in any sealing. The chakra system was strong enough to handle the sealing without getting damaged, but still malleable enough to adapt between 10 to 13 years of age, the specifics depending on the individual. The 3 best, weaponized, Jinchuriki had been sealed below that range, but it was considered a rather stupid risk. Any child that had coils developed strongly to even attempt such a sealing would be a powerhouse later in life given proper training, not something a village was likely to throw away on the off chance that they might survive. Not to mention the consequences of a failed sealing would result in the death of countless more ninja. Kumo's Kurabi was considered the most successful weaponized Jinchuriki. He'd had the Hachibi sealed within him at the age of 5. Why he'd been selected was a secret that they'd managed to keep from the rest of the hidden villages, but it was obvious they'd known what they were doing. Kumo had resealed the Nibi a few years back in an 11-year-old girl, which suggested that whatever it was that made them confident that the Hachibi wasn't going to blow up in their faces had something to do with the container and not their sealing method. That was a relief to the rest of the hidden villages and probably saved the girl from excessive assassination attempts. The idea of Kumo having 2 Jinchuriki of Kurabi's caliber was a rather scary one. Kirigakure's current Mizukage had the Sanbi sealed within him at the age of 7. Kiri's Niidaime hadn't hid his methods, but no other village was likely to follow in his footsteps. He'd taken 5 years to set up a complex sealing array that could handle multiple failures and proceeded to attempt to seal the demon into child after child, his youngest and most promising candidates first. Each failure meant the death of the child, and it had taken 18 attempts before a successful sealing. And it didn't end there. The Mizukage hadn't been satisfied with the level of integration, and rather than waiting to see if it improved as the seal settled, he summarily had the demon ripped out and the process restarted. 12 more attempts had resulted in Yagura. The death toll didn't end with the 30 children either. The sealing array had been designed for the sole purpose of facilitating multiple attempts at the sealing with little regards to anything else, like the safety of the operators. Every single ninja powering the massive ceiling array had been contaminated by prolonged exposure to the Biju's chakra, over half dying painfully within weeks. While he was nowhere near Kurabi or Yagura's level, Suna's Jinchuriki was the one all the hidden villages were keeping a close eye on. Sabaku no Gaara was one of a kind. Like Naruto, he was genetically predisposed to being a Jinchuriki, although Suna kept a tight lid on the specifics of why that was. Unlike Naruto, that fact was completely intentional. The Yondaime Kage had selected a wife for the sole purpose of creating Gaara. His first two children hadn't met the criteria he'd been aiming for, but his second son had, allowing him to take the concept of integration to a whole new level. The Ichibi had been sealed into Gaara in utero, before his own chakra system had even formed properly. Suna certainly hadn't let any outsiders examine the boy, so all the other nations had was educated guesswork and speculation. But the general consensus was that his system had been developed by the demon's chakra, and that he very likely didn't produce his own chakra at all. On the one hand, that meant that he could use his demon's chakra 24/7. On the other hand, that meant he was using the demon's chakra 24/7, and it showed. Sabaku no Gaara was a special kind of crazy. Considering that he'd been under the mental influence of the Ichibi's chakra his entire life, it was a bit surprising that he wasn't running around foaming at the mouth and trying to kill everything that moved, but his tendency to indiscriminately squish people in his general vicinity showed that he definitely wasn't shrugging off the Ichibi's mental contamination. All in all, this made Gaara a very limited shinobi despite his frightening potential. He was exceptionally good at killing things, but his utility didn't really extend beyond that. He wasn't picky about who he killed either, so he didn't do well in delicate situations or team operations either. Fortunately for Gaara, there were plenty of missions that were suited to unsubtle killing machines. It was with all this in mind that Kakashi couldn't help but feel uncomfortable as he met Naruto's glare with a mask of disinterest. He was ashamed of the vague sense of disappointment in the boy that he felt, something that Naruto certainly hadn't done anything to deserve. Kakashi hadn't had a concrete image of what Naruto should be like, but the boy in front of him just wasn't connecting to any expectations he'd had for Minato's son. There was some part of him that had always taken for granted that he'd get the opportunity to be for Naruto what Minato had been for him, a cross between a teacher, an older brother, and a father figure. He'd known that Naruto wasn't going to be a mini Minato, but he was having a hard time seeing much of his teacher at all in the boy. Sure, he had the same hair and eye color as his father, and his facial structure was even starting to resemble a young Minato's. However, it was hard to relate the two beyond the superficial. Like Naruto, a young Minato had also expressed a desire to be the Hokage in order to be acknowledged, although his motivation wasn't quite the same as his son's. Wanting to be a Kage wasn't an uncommon childhood aspiration. Who wouldn't dream of being the strongest and most respected ninja in their village? It was a bit weird to characterize Minato's childhood desire to become the Hokage as nothing fundamentally special given that he did end up getting the position, but was how he'd started out. His reasons had changed and gained depth as he grew and matured, but they had never been as intrinsic to the core of his character as Naruto's motivations were to his. The idea that he could one day become the Hokage and rid himself of the scorn of the village was perhaps the only thing keeping Naruto's self-worth and optimism intact over the years. It wasn't like he'd ever been physically mistreated, and it was rare that anyone went out of their way to try and make his day any worse, but the social isolation he faced was far from insignificant. The vast majority of the citizens of Konoha, civilian and shinobi alike, wanted as little contact with the boy as possible, and they especially didn't want him around their children. There'd been something of an outcry when he'd been admitted to the academy. Things had settled a bit when it became apparent that Naruto wasn't snapping and killing anybody who hurt him in a spar, but many parents still chose to hold their children back until the next class intake just in case. It wasn't that they thought he was the Kyuubi, except in a few rare cases, but they were acutely aware that he was a Jinchuriki. The villagers who had only a layman's knowledge of sealing and the notion of a Jinchuriki didn't need to think about things very much before deciding to stay the hell away from Naruto. But learning more about the situation hadn't reassured anyone. Jinchuriki as a group were more naturally dangerous than just about anyone else. An unavoidable fact of life is that children don't always get along. In a ninja village that sometimes escalated a bit beyond bruises and tears, But even the children from clans weren't usually capable of doing anything particularly damaging before they'd been taught enough restraint, especially since the fall of the Uchiha clan. Pressuring 6-year-olds to learn how to breathfire in order to prove their worth hadn't been the most prudent tradition, but they'd managed to avoid anything more serious than some ugly scars. No one wanted to risk having their kid be the one that hurt Naruto, pissed him off, or upset him in any way. It wasn't a secret that a Jinchuriki drawing upon their demon's chakra could be triggered by strong negative emotions, and the idea that a little roughhousing gone wrong or name-calling gone too far could involve Naruto was terrifying to parents. That was even assuming that he was a normal Jinchuriki and ignoring the excessively potent nature of the Kyuubi's chakra. Konoha was no less aware of the amount of time the Yondaime had to prepare for the sealing than Kumo, resulting in much the same kind of conclusion: a defective seal. Rather than thinking that the seal was too tight, the citizens were scared that it might not be tight enough. What if he were constantly radiating small amounts of the Kyuubi's chakra or was more likely to draw on it in a fit of anger? Or both? The damage the Kyuubi had wrought on the village wasn't limited to what it had directly done. Its toxic chakra had hurt the village in unprecedented ways. A horrifying number of miscarriages could be linked to that night. There was a reason Naruto was one of the youngest in his class. The adverse effects exposure to a bijus were nothing new or surprising, but the extent to which the relatively brief attack had affected the village was concerning. It didn't seem like it could be explained just by the fact that the Kyuubi was the most powerful biju, but that was the only viable explanation floating around. Although Naruto had never exhibited any signs that he was giving off any damaging chakra or drawing on the Kyuubi's chakra at all, Konoha as a whole just didn't have confidence in his seal. The children picked up on the attitudes of the adults, and without knowing why playing with or hanging around Naruto was a bad thing had internalized the idea that he was somehow different in a bad way. Without knowing about the Kyuubi, it just wasn't possible to see Naruto as dangerous, so their focus landed on what they did know about him. His poor grades, social awkwardness, proclamations of one day becoming the Hokage, and constant striving for attention seemed to paint a picture of a clown with delusions of grandeur. So Naruto's efforts to make the village acknowledge his existence became just another reason to ignore and ostracize him. The Sandaime leaving Naruto out in the open had turned out to be a brilliant move on many more levels than Kakashi had believed possible when it came to keeping Naruto safe with minimal effort, but the end result was anything but satisfying to Kakashi. Naruto deserved better than this. He should have been brought up in secret and not subjected to the isolated life he'd been left adrift in. As it stood, he was Minato's son in blood only. Kakashi wished that he could have been in a position to raise Naruto like Minato would have wanted, but he'd been far from fit to take care of an infant 13 years ago. Looking back, he thought even his no-doubt fumbling attempts at raising a child would have been better than what Naruto had endured, but he knew for a fact that Sarutobi wouldn't have allowed it. Kakashi had tried to take custody Naruto around the time the boy had entered the academy but had been firmly denied. It was obvious to him that the boy needed an adult in his life full-time. Sarutobi was a kind and caring grandfather figure, and Ichiraku Tuchi and Ayame were also great influences in his life, but for all intents and purposes Naruto had been left to raise himself. When this team had been officially assigned to him, Kakashi had been firmly warned that he wasn't to treat Naruto any differently than if he were just another orphan. No teaching him about Minato's philosophies or passing on his personal techniques. Sarutobi had said they could revisit the issue when Naruto became a Chunin, but it seemed absurd that he would ever be promoted under these handicaps. Kakashi realized that he'd been staring at Naruto too long. He'd spent only a few moments visibly looking at Sasuke and Sakura, but he couldn't help but wander in his thoughts when he got to Naruto. He'd been maintaining eye contact with the boy for about 8 seconds in silence, none of them having recovered sufficiently from Kakashi's odd opening line to brave saying anything. Naruto had been visibly uncomfortable under Kakashi's scrutiny. He'd been understandably confused when it became obvious that he'd been singled out, his body betraying his discomfort almost immediately through nearly invisible fidgeting and shifting. Nothing his classmates would be able to detect, but Anbu captains were trained to be a bit more observant than recently graduated academy students. It was Naruto suddenly stilling that was the warning sign that had pulled Kakashi from his thoughts. The nervousness in his body language had been replaced by signs of an aggressive fight or flight response and defiance. That didn't mean Naruto was about to attack or run away, but it did indicate that he thought himself as under attack or on the defensive from Kakashi in some way. Given his recent experience with Mizuki and revelation of why he was viewed in such a poor light by most of the village, Kakashi could make a guess as to the kind of conclusion Naruto had likely come to. Not exactly my idea of a great first impression, Kakashi thought to himself, ignoring that even without the judgmental staring he'd still called his students boring to their face within moments of officially laying eyes on them. Pretending he hadn't been staring wouldn't undo the damage, so he'd have to improvise. You do realize wearing that much orange is weird, right? Kakashi remarked, as though that had been the reason behind his extended observation. Weird? Naruto spluttered indignantly, totally caught off guard, as Sakura giggled and Sasuke's face tightened to stifle a smile. Orange isn't weird, it's awesome. You're weird, with your weird, hair. You have weird hair, and a weird mouth, you weirdo. I have a weird mouth? Kakashi questioned amusedly, satisfied with his deflection. Naruto's body language had immediately opened up as his fear that he was being judged for the Kyuubi was dealt with. Is it orange? No, or it would be awesome. Naruto winced as his brain apparently caught up with his mouth. Okay, maybe that wouldn't be awesome. But you wouldn't need to wear a mask if you had a normal mouth. It's probably all fat and fuzzy. With warts. Huh? Did you say something? Kakashi asked, utilizing his favorite tactic for dealing with things he couldn't be bothered with, pretending they never happened or didn't exist. Freaking weirdo, Naruto muttered. How about we take this to the roof, Kakashi said over Naruto's grumbling. It's too nice a day to waste cooped up inside. The truth was that the strong smell of Sakura's perfume was irritating his sensitive sense of smell in the confined space of the classroom. He was sure all the other girls had prettied themselves up similarly for their first official day as ninja, but given how long ago they'd left, she was the only one committing assault on his senses with teenage vanity. Then why did you make us wait in here for 3 hours? Naruto growled tersely. Kakashi strolled out of the room, followed quickly by Sakura and Sasuke. He heard Naruto faintly as he talked to himself, followed by the sound of displaced air and his chakra signature abruptly vanishing. This is so not my problem. He's all yours, boss. Neither Sakura nor Sasuke's hearing was as acute as Kakashi's, but they'd heard him say something and realized that he'd remained in the classroom. Sakura growled as she went back to the classroom entrance from where they'd gotten to in the hallway. She hadn't expressed any displeasure with Kakashi for making them wait, but she had no such restraint when it came to her blonde teammate holding them up. This is not the time for your stupid games, Naruto. She stopped abruptly in confusion as she looked into the classroom, discovering that he'd disappeared. Well, he'd actually dispelled, but the girl didn't know he'd been a shadow clone. Naruto. She bit out each syllable like a curse as she stomped into the classroom, intent on finding out where he was hiding. Get your butt out here. After a few minutes of increasingly disturbing threats, the clattering of chairs being thrown around, and then finally a frustrated scream that actually sent a shiver down Kakashi's spine, Sakura reappeared from the classroom. Naruto's not in the classroom, sensei, she informed him demurely, speaking to him directly for the first time with a sweet smile on her face, not a hair out of place. Let's just head to the roof and take things from there. Acting like nothing out of the ordinary had just happened was definitely the way to deal with that. Wasn't she supposed to be the normal one? Kakashi wondered, not very hopefully. Sakura definitely wasn't happy having to wait for Naruto before they could begin when they got to the roof, but thankfully the fact that Sasuke was remaining completely calm and unbothered was keeping her in check. Personally, Kakashi was more impressed than annoyed. Sure, leaving a clone to meet your sensei for the first time was a bit rude, but he was familiar with just how difficult it was to get a clone to do something you yourself didn't feel like doing. They did have the exact same mindset as their creators, and with the exception of dying or being maimed, had pretty much the same kinds of dislikes. They also had a clear advantage in that they could escape any semblance of responsibility by dispelling. For a personality type like Naruto's, that last part was probably very significant. Kakashi had once spent an hour and a half trying to convince his clone to deal with a clogged toilet, arguing that it was a necessity because he didn't want any lingering smells attached to him when he went on a date. The clone had wanted to read cover to cover the real copy of the Platinum Plus edition Icha Icha Beach Wars specially printed, with Jiraiya's permission, that had Kakashi's name replacing the original protagonist. The one that he never let leave his person. Of course that was unacceptable. He'd never let another man, not even himself, handle his most beloved possession, so he'd tried to convince clone Kakashi to read the shadow copy it had come equipped with. Eureka had not been impressed the next day when he'd explained to her that he'd been morally obligated to finish a debate about the nature of reality and value of frailty with himself. He didn't think she had the right to complain, given that she'd only waited 30 minutes before deciding that he'd stood her up. Everyone knew his attitude towards punctuality, so she should have taken his showing up only 1 hour and 45 minutes late for the compliment that it was. She hadn't appreciated it when he tried to explain that either. Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke had all reacted differently to his lack of punctuality. Naruto had been predictably straightforward in expressing his anger at having to wait for him. Sakura had redirected her anger at the blameless classroom, and Sasuke seemed to brush off his annoyance. On the surface, Sasuke appeared to be the most mature of the three. In fact, many of his teachers had been praising him in their reports since he was 7 years old as the most mature and self-possessed academy student I've ever known, and similar sentiments. The smarter ones had known better than to assume that he'd gotten marvelous therapy after the destruction of his clan and come out 6 months later the most well-adjusted kid in the village. Sasuke had gotten, and continued to get, top-notch therapy, and it had been effective, but he was a long way off from mentally healthy. The reason he appeared so mature was that he didn't care for the validation of his peers or pretty much anyone else. That meant he never felt the normal pressures to adapt himself to a group of friends, or put any effort into forming or maintaining relationships. While immunity to peer pressure might seem like a desirable personality trait, it was extremely troubling to see in a child. It removed any incentive to learn how to interact socially. Sasuke's complete disregard for the opinions of his classmates would have resulted his being ignored right back if it weren't for his coolness factor. His obvious skills, status as the prince of an elite clan, and tragic backstory had prompted the social hierarchy of his class elevate him to a position of prestige instead of pushing him to the fringe like it would have if he were less noteworthy. Naruto showed up a few minutes after his clone had dispelled, flipping over the fence surrounding the roof. Judging by the speed by which Kakashi had sensed him come up the building, he had to have been using chakra to run up the side. That was both a pleasant and unpleasant surprise to the Junin. It meant that Naruto hadn't been pointlessly wasting his time trying the leaf concentration exercise, but had worked up to it by first completing the tree climbing exercise. It also meant that someone had trained him. There were a lot of good reasons not to teach any advanced chakra exercises to academy students. And while many of them didn't apply to Naruto's unique situation, the fact that he'd initially been failed for not being able to perform the basic clone technique meant that the academy teachers hadn't cared about or been aware of his need for such training. Kakashi hadn't been allowed to train Naruto, but clearly someone had. Maybe it had only been to address the obvious issue of his chakra control, but that should have been his job. "Did you have fun making us wait?" Sakura began in a normal tone of voice, before beginning to emit a passable imitation of killing intent partway through her sentence. Hehe, Naruto laughed weakly, his customary smile faltering as the girl stared him down. His eyes darted around nervously, refusing to meet hers. What happened was, I got lost on the road of life? What? Sakura's eyebrow was twitching. She clearly wasn't impressed. You know what? I don't care. We've wasted enough time with your nonsense. Naruto wilted at her harsh dismissal. He moved to sit down beside her, but her accusing stare made him change his mind half to the ground and he moved to the other side of Sasuke. Kakashi was puzzled and suspicious. Naruto being late wasn't suspicious. He had a fair idea of how that had happened. Naruto being late and then throwing out that particular excuse could hardly be a coincidence, but he gave no indication that he knew anything about Kakashi. Could it be that he was just casting around for an excuse that didn't admit he'd ditched his teammates, and it really was a coincidence? Now that we're all here, let's begin with you three introducing yourselves, Kakashi said, putting his suspicions aside for the moment. What do you want to know? Sakura asked, her demeanor changing the instant she focused on him. How about your likes, dislikes, and dreams for the future? Kakashi threw out casually. Things like that. Why don't you show us how it's done? Naruto challenged. Yeah, we don't know anything about you either, Sakura agreed. Not even your name. Fair enough, Kakashi agreed facetiously. He knew plenty about them. My name is Hitaki Kakashi. I have no desire to tell you my likes and dislikes. Dreams for the future? I've got some of those. And some nice hobbies as well. What the hell was that? Naruto complained. All you told us was your name. Would you have preferred it if I didn't tell you my name? It's your turn, starting on the right. Our right or your right? Naruto asked. My right, of course. Why would I care about your rights? Kakashi quipped. Okay, Naruto said, taking his clarification at face value. Sasuke caught the double meaning, and narrowed his eyes as he tried to figure out if Kakashi had meant it. Yosh, my name is Uzumaki Naruto. I like ramen. Cup ramen is nice, but Ichiraku's ramen is the best. Especially for breakfast. I like it even more when Iruka-sensei pays for my ramen, or when Ichiraku-ji lets me eat all I can on my birthday. I also like training and awesome jutsu. And friendly people, and Yuki-kun. He's my pet plant by the way, and I like other plants too, but Yuki-kun is. You don't need to tell us everything you like, Kakashi interrupted, as it was clear that Naruto was perfectly happy continuing indefinitely. And plants don't count as pets. Plants do too count as pets, Naruto pouted. If you can have a pet rock, a pet plant is way more awesome. And I wasn't saying everything, just the important stuff. If you say so. A pet rock? My dream? Wait, dislikes first. Well, number one would have to be the 3 minutes that I have to wait for ramen to cook, especially when I steal my ramen before I can eat it. And my dream? Does this kid listen to what comes out of his mouth? Kakashi wondered. Sure, he could sort of figure out what that had meant, knowing what he did about Cage Bunshin. But Sasuke and Sakura were probably thinking that Naruto had lost his marbles judging by how they were looking at him. To be fair, it was obvious that Naruto had gotten a bit distracted when he mentioned his dream, so he probably wasn't paying much attention to his backtracking. It wasn't hard to guess why either. How had Naruto's ambition to become Hokage been affected by the knowledge of the Kyuubi? Kakashi hadn't heard any reports or seen any evidence that Naruto had been hit too hard by the knowledge. In a way, Mizuki might have done them a favor with the clumsy reveal. Sure, the idea that the villagers actually thought he was the Kyuubi was patently absurd. Of the rare few that did, most actually belonged to a weird cult that actually worshipped him as the Kyuubi's incarnation of mercy or something wacky like that. They were generally harmless, and some of the gifts they tried to give Naruto were deemed okay enough of that the Sandaime actually let them get to him. If Naruto believed that the problem was that they thought he was the Kyuubi, then he could just show he wasn't and the situation could only improve from there. That hopefully meant he could deal with part of the revelation now, and the harsh reality that even if people thought he was the nicest guy they'd ever met, they might still fear him, want to use him as a weapon, or both. Naruto had trailed off as he thought about what to say, but his expression cleared as he reached some kind of conclusion. My dream is to surpass every Hokage, every ninja that ever lived, Naruto said, his determination showing so firmly that even Sasuke and Sakura were taken aback. And as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone as Naruto's serious face shifted into a pensive frown. Although once I had a dream that I took over all the villages and ended all the fighting so that everybody could focus on important stuff. Naruto nodded sagely, a smile on his face as he thought about it. Like making ramen. Yeah, that would be the next step. Well, that was interesting, Kakashi thought, repressing the urge to facepalm. And weird, and maybe a bit disturbing. Oh, and I have hobbies. Naruto continued excitedly, his serious and mature demeanor having completely evaporated. Pranks, trying new kinds of ramen, training, gardening, inventing awesome jutsu. That perverted jutsu is not awesome. Sakura interrupted hotly. Not that one. There's other ones, he protested unconvincingly, unwilling to provide details. Even more perverted? Sakura asked dangerously. Of course not. Not that there's anything wrong with Oiroge no Jutsu, he grumbled. Sakura's eye twitched menacingly. I mean, it's Sasuke's turn. Naruto threw out, panicking. That sounds right to me, Kakashi cut in. Not that he didn't want to hear more about this, Oiroge no Jutsu, but as amusing as the two bickering were, there was a point to this meeting. Sasuke rolled his eyes, but otherwise didn't move from the position he'd maintained since the moment he'd sat down. Elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced in front his face. My name is Uchiha Sasuke. There are lots of things I dislike and I don't really like anything. I wouldn't say that I have a dream, but I have an ambition. His voice, which had been level and uncaring to that point, tightened along with his fingers. The resurrection of my clan, and to kill a certain man. Something about the way he subtly emphasized the word kill made everything else he said revolve around it chillingly. Much like how everything else in his life revolved around the desire to kill his brother. The trauma of the Uchiha clan being massacred followed by mental torture, all at the hands of his brother, had shattered him. The recovery that he made had been built upon the strongest parts of his identity that had been left, resulting in an understandably single-minded obsession on his part. For Sasuke, everything came back to what he considered his duty to the clan, and anything that even hinted at getting in the way of that was treated with disdain at best, explosive fury at worst. Kakashi could relate, on some level. His own situation with his father's suicide didn't measure up to the tragedy of the Uchiha clan, but few in the village could claim anything on that level. What was similar between them was that the loss of their respective fathers had left them unable to fulfill their expectations. Kakashi had come to terms with his father's suicide, but Sasuke was still in a horrible mental position. Uchiha Fugaku had been a stoic man, but the pride he felt in his eldest son had always been obvious. Sasuke had always held his brother in the highest regard, but had always hungered for his father's pride. He'd always wanted his father to look at him like he did Itachi, but despite his natural talent, it was clear he wasn't the same kind of prodigy as his elder brother. Itachi had been a proxy father figure, his acknowledgement of Sasuke a very important support for his self-esteem. Fugaku dying at Itachi's hand had destroyed any chance for Sasuke to gain his father's pride and respect, but the psychological reports that Kakashi had read actually suggested that the loss of Itachi had been more traumatic than the rest of the clan put together. Sasuke wanted Itachi's respect and he hated himself for it. He wanted his father's respect, which was essentially impossible. There were two goals that he had that were keeping him, relatively, sane. The first and most important was to utterly destroy Itachi, as proving himself superior to his brother would be the closest he could get to gaining acknowledgement from his father and the best way to punish Itachi for abandoning him. The second was to rebuild the Uchiha clan as the greatest clan in the elemental nations, also to please the memory of his father. Killing Itachi was a problematic goal, especially given Sasuke's need to prove himself unquestionably superior. It wasn't something he realized consciously, but simply killing Itachi very likely wouldn't satisfy him. That wouldn't be enough to prove his worth to himself. He'd need to beat down Itachi in direct combat. At 13, Sasuke had graduated the academy at the top of his class. At 13, Itachi had succeeded Kakashi as an Anbu captain. Itachi had gained his Sharingan at the age of 8. Whereas Sasuke didn't even know if he was one of the few Uchiha actually capable of unlocking his bloodline. What he wanted was more or less suicidal. Naruto had no trouble breaking the tension caused by Sasuke's introduction. It's not me, right? Because that's complete overkill if this is about the pheromones and Inuzuka kennel. That was just supposed to involve Akamaru. That was you? Sasuke hissed, his composure broken. Did you somehow get that impression? Naruto hedged nervously. Because that was just speculation. It sounds like something Kiba would do, doesn't it? That guy, he's always messing things up. Of course it was you, Sasuke sneered. And if I wanted you dead, that's not something that would be difficult enough to be an ambition. It would just be a chore. Hey, Naruto said, before reconsidering. Actually, if that means you don't want to kill me, that's completely fine. Oh, I wouldn't go that far, Sasuke said, smirking darkly. You can be really scary sometimes. Sasuke just shrugged, maybe conceding the point. I have no idea what's going on, Kakashi admitted to himself. Was it banter, or was Naruto's obliviousness volunteering him for a place on Sasuke's hit list? The Uchiha seemed genuinely amused, at least in small intervals, which was incredibly rare for him. But he seemed just as genuinely hostile. What moron thought putting these two on the same team was a good idea? Okay, and lastly the girl. My name is Haruno Sakura, and the thing I like is, she looked at Sasuke, blushing deeply. Well, the person I like is, and, my dream for the future is, She started giggling, still staring at Sasuke, whose eyes widened in alarm. What I dislike is Naruto. Her mood shifted instantly as she glared at the blonde, who hung his head dejectedly. And just as suddenly she was blushing and gazing at Sasuke again. My hobby is, Seriously, did someone think up the least cohesive team possible and say, "This'll be hilarious"? That's it for the introductions then, Kakashi said, when it was clear that Sakura was finished. Tomorrow you'll start your duties as shinobi. Duties? Duties. Naruto perked up instantly. Yeah, what kinds of duties? First, we're going to do something with just the four of us, Kakashi said, chuckling ominously. Where the hell am I? Naruto wondered out loud. After having so much of his day wasted by waiting around for his new sensei, he'd gone a little overboard afterwards on the physical conditioning. He hadn't fallen asleep in a training ground again, as that was a mistake he wasn't likely to repeat, but the next thing he knew he was in a dark tunnel. Ew, he complained as his foot sloshed in the ankle-deep water. The rusty metal pipes lining the tunnel made the place look somewhat like a larger version of the sewer tunnels that ran underneath Konoha. He'd hidden down there after pranking the Hyugas once. Thankfully the smell wasn't the same. The air was a little stale and damp, but there wasn't even a hint of waste and chemicals. Maybe it was a genjutsu? Sneaking into his room to put him in an illusion sounded like the kind of thing Kakashi-sensei might do. He was way weird like that. There was a section in Hiruzen's book about how ninjutsu and genjutsu could be used together. It was one of the many kinds of things that he wasn't even close to being able to do yet, as he hadn't even tried out regular genjutsu yet, but he liked to read about them anyway. He'd always dismissed genjutsu as useless and wimpy, but reading about collaborative jutsu and hybrids involving illusions had clued him into just how dangerous and awesome the field could really be. Since he didn't want to end up attacking a tree with his super awesome ninjutsu while his enemy just bashed his head in from behind, Naruto had been looking into genjutsu. Specifically how to defend himself from it, as very precise chakra control was needed for more than the most basic of illusions. Due to the vast array of unfamiliar words, like prosencephalon, mind-bending, in a mind-hurting kind of way, concepts, and the lack of immediate benefits when compared to training in ninjutsu or taijutsu, he hadn't spent too much time studying genjutsu yet. That was an oversight he was regretting rather keenly at the moment. According to the most understandable reference he'd found on the subject, most genjutsu use relied on the target not noticing they were being affected. Sometimes subtle genjutsu could be used on even experienced shinobi for days, or an obvious one could achieve its purpose in the few seconds it took for the target to realize it was there and dispel it. The easier the genjutsu was to use, the easier it tended to be to deal with. Genjutsu was about deception, so making them difficult to detect was generally much more useful than making them hard to break. Techniques that were designed to resist being dispelled rather than being detected was a much more difficult branch of the art, and much more rare to encounter. If this was a genjutsu, it was far too obvious to be relying on its hiddenness to be effective, which supported Naruto's suspicion that it was some sort of test. Or that weirdo screwing with him. So either the basic techniques he knew had a decent chance of getting him out of this, or Kakashi was a crazy genjutsu master who messed with people for fun. Oh shit, that sounds like Kakashi-sensei, Naruto realized as he thought about what he knew about the man. This experience was far too immersive and detailed to have a simple solution. Regardless, what little he knew about dealing with genjutsu was all he had to work with. Naruto relaxed and began focusing as best he could on his chakra flow. As soon as he started paying attention to it, he realized that something was wrong. Normally his chakra raged against any attempt to control it, something he'd been making slow but steady improvements to, but now it eagerly responded to his whims. Under normal conditions that would have delighted him, but in the context of a genjutsu messing with his senses, it terrified him. How could he know that what he thought he was doing with his chakra was actually happening? This was on a completely different level than what he knew how to deal with. There were 3 methods of affecting genjutsu that Naruto knew about and thought he could use. The 3 most basic chakra-based methods were pulse, suppress, and overwhelm. While pulse was the stock method for dealing with common genjutsu, this seemed anything but, and the added problem of his perception of his chakra being wonky skewed things even further. Suppress felt like his best bet. When he'd first tried to slow down the chakra flow in his body after reading about it, nothing really happened. Now though, he could feel it calming, and it was actually very relaxing. And it even seemed to be working. The light had faded away and he couldn't feel the water at his feet anymore. There was a definite limit though, and after holding it for half a minute without any sign of the illusion breaking, he gave it up as a lost cause. As soon as he let go, the dim light returned and water at his feet rose again. Well shit. Naruto frowned. That had sort of seemed like it was doing something, but not enough apparently. So maybe going the other direction would work. He'd had more luck with overwhelm in his training anyways. Generally speaking, anywhere overwhelm worked, suppress worked better, more efficiently, and far more subtly, but he didn't have any better ideas. As expected, ramping up his chakra flow was easy for him. Like with suppress, it worked far better than ever before. He pushed it far further than he ever had, until it felt like there was molten euphoria in his veins, making him lightheaded. The tunnel had gotten almost painfully bright, the ground beneath him was vibrating, and the water at his feet was flowing? Naruto suddenly became aware of an ominous rushing sound, and the water having risen to his knees did not bode well. Oh, not good, Naruto said weakly as he caught sight of the incoming wall of water. Phew, the water smashed into him before he could do anything, first impacting him straight on and then bouncing him off the ground. Not that there was anything he could have done with more time. Dazed, he couldn't do anything but try and hold his breath as the water dragged him along. He couldn't even tell which way was which with the speed he was going. Just when he thought he wouldn't last any longer, he was suddenly falling through the air. He had the presence of mind to take a deep breath and angle himself into a dive. It wasn't perfect, but he managed to avoid belly flopping on the surface of the water 100 feet below. He swam up to the surface, gasping and coughing as he broke it. Every inch of his body ached, so he just lay on his back, floating and recovering for a few minutes. I'm going to get you for this, Kakashi, he threatened when his breath came back to him. I'm going to drown you in orange paint, you weirdo asswipe. Applying chakra to his palms, he hoisted himself onto the surface of the water, shaking some of the cold water off when he was fully standing. There was no obvious light source, but the area around him was dimly lit. There was darkness in every direction, and he couldn't see anything except a row of thick iron poles 30 feet away from him, spaced evenly about 15 feet apart and stretching up into the dark. And hanging between two of them was a paper with a familiar-looking inscription on it. A seal? Naruto wondered. What exactly was going on here? Yes, Naruto felt chills go down his spine at the deep, heavy voice that reverberated through him. The sound seeped into the air like it was a physical phenomenon. Slowly and fearfully, he looked up. On the other side of the bars, two large, glowing red eyes stared down at him. The slit pupils were probably as tall as he was. This, Naruto began weakly, swallowing as he tried to get the words out. This isn't a genjutsu, is it? No. Naruto shivered at the sound. He had no idea how he stood there, waiting. It could have been seconds or minutes, but the silence and those glowing eyes watching him became intolerable. So, hi? His voice was a little higher pitched than he would have liked, but at least it wasn't the terrified screaming of a 6-year-old girl that he could feel trying to work its way out of him. He couldn't see anything but the eyes and a general silhouette, but there was no doubt that the Kyuubi no Yoko was on the other side of those bars. 5 seconds passed. You're smaller than I would have expected. Naruto may have been scared out of his mind, but he wasn't about to let that get in the way of his pride. I'm average for my age. You're just too big, so don't go picking fun at me, you furball. Naruto shouted, his nervousness fading with each word he successfully managed not to choke on. Not that I'm saying you're fat or anything. Just big? I'm sure you're the perfect size for a giant, 9-tailed fox. There wasn't any reason not to be a bit polite, after all. What is your name, child? Uzumaki Naruto. At least it didn't seem offended. Do you have a name? Or something you'd like me to call you? Uzumaki? Not unexpected. You did something. What? Naruto asked, nonplussed by the abrupt accusation. I don't know. You did something. I don't feel anything from the outside in this cage. Not even the passing of time, the Kyuubi said, its voice rising in timbre and tempo. But this, I felt. Uzumaki Naruto, what did you do? The last 4 words boomed out with such force that Naruto almost fell over. An almost tangible pressure bore down on him, emanating from those glowing eyes. It was hard to breathe. Could you be more specific? Naruto suggested hopefully. Having the Kyuubi angry at him wasn't something he really wanted, even with the, hopefully, impregnable seal between. I promise I won't do it again. You misunderstand, Uzumaki. Find out what you did. I will bring you back here when you do it again. It will be easier next time. You think I'm going to do something just because a demon tells me to? Naruto retorted, not because I have commanded it. Whatever you have done cannot be undone. Making you aware of this has only sped up the process, Uzumaki. Even if you do not replicate it, whatever you have done will manifest itself. And you will turn to me for help, because only I will be able to. Naruto frowned. Well, what did I do to myself that's so important? And why are you making such a big deal out my being in Uzumaki? You said it was not unexpected. What does that even mean? I don't know what you've done, the Kyuubi admitted, but it was something of a nature I haven't felt for a very long time. And of course you'd be in Uzumaki. Even if that hair of yours is a bit misleading, your chakra definitely fits. My hair? Naruto asked, baffled. My chakra? What? You don't know? Naruto shook his head numbly. The Kyuubi knew something about his family. The Kyuubi? What was going on? You don't know. How can you not? The Kyuubi trailed off, before bursting out into booming laughter. The sound startled Naruto so badly he lost his concentration and fell back into the water. He came up sputtering. Hey, shut up! Naruto yelled as he got back on top of the water. Tell me what you mean. Stop laughing. There was no way that he could be heard over the laughter. Your clan is, the Kyuubi forced out through its sniggering, which was disturbing, hee. Your clan. The Uzumaki are, or were, the glowing golden chains shot through the air, passing through the bars to snake around the demon, who tried to scramble back. No. The chains whipped around its jaws, snapping them shut with a sound like a thunderclap. Naruto got his first actual look at the Kyuubi, illuminated by the light of the chains for a brief moment before it was dragged underwater, struggling violently. Naruto would never forget the look on its face, the eyes that had so terrified him wide and bulging in fear. The Kyuubi was scared shitless. The water in the cage frothed and whipped around, a tail or limb occasionally surfacing, but it was as if there was an invisible barrier between the bars of the cage stopping any of the waves from coming through. Glowing inscriptions had appeared on the bars, and the ink on the paper seal was writhing. Naruto turned around as he tracked the many chains to the source on his side of the cage. Standing there with an expression of intense concentration and strain on her face, gripping two of the chains and with many more coming out of the wide sleeves of her pure white kimono, was the most beautiful woman Naruto had ever seen. For a moment, he could do nothing but stare, arrested by her presence. She had long, flowing dark red hair down to her ankles. Her pale skin was flawless, marked only by a small diamond-shaped mark on her forehead. Green-blue eyes pierced into his own as they met. Who? You must leave, she bit out tersely. Even her voice was exquisite, lilting and melodic. It isn't safe for you here. The more contact you have with the beast, the more dangerous it will be. But I don't. Go. Her voice took on an odd dual tone, resonating in his head. He tried speak again, explained that he didn't know how to go anywhere from this place, but everything was fuzzing out like he was falling asleep. As soon as Naruto faded away, the strain disappeared from the woman's face. She walked leisurely to the cage, passing through the bars without hesitation. Rather than soaking her, the water being flung around bent around her form as though in avoidance. She stopped in the middle of the chaos, casually pulling on one of the chains. The Kyuubi's head was drawn out of the water not 5 feet from her, bring them eye to eye. Or eye to woman given the difference in sizes. The Kyuubi stilled with a final muffled growl, acknowledging the futility of its struggle. Why did you bring him here? The woman asked coldly. Her face might as well have been carved from ice for all the emotion it showed. The Kyuubi ignored her question in favor of its own as the chains around its jaws loosened. How can you be here? You're not a part of the seal. I would have known. You can't be here. You can't be out there. But you are, aren't you? I have no interest in rectifying your ignorance, beast. You knew better, but you brought him here anyways. Why? The Kyuubi stared at her for a few moments, but a slight tightening of the chains prompted an answer. Even Biju get bored. Meeting my newest prison, however distasteful, momentarily seemed like a suitable distraction. I was under the impression that you were dead, so what would have been the harm? Don't think for a moment I believe that. Keep your secrets if you wish. You haven't said anything that would compromise him, and you won't if you don't want to spend the rest of your time here chained underwater. The chakra chains abruptly dissipated as she turned around and walked away casually, completely unconcerned about the demon in the cage with her. She paused, turning to face him when she was on the other side of the bars. Do not bring him here again. I didn't know this seal allowed you two to communicate before, but it won't take me so long to respond now that I'm aware of it. Although I suppose I should thank you for your creativity, as this link could prove useful to me in the future. She faded away as if she were a mirage, just in time to avoid hearing the Kyuubi howl in anguished fury. Your arrogance will be your undoing. The Kyuubi growled at the empty cell, its anger tinged with triumph. You missed it. You were here, you saw him, and you missed it, Mito. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.